Thank you very much. Yes, if I ask, name a woman scientist, I know what's coming. The problem is no other name comes. And I am very late coming to the issue of women in science because for the longest time I didn't realize it was an issue. In the house where I grew up, science was just an everyday topic. My mother had trained as a chemist, and my father was a family doctor, so he had his practice in our house, so his patients became part of our discussion, their problems, their ailments. And I attended a high school that was specialized in science, and although the boys outnumbered the girls in a ratio of about 4-1, no one ever discouraged me or made me feel I didn't belong there. And certainly in my family, nobody thought it was odd for a girl to be interested in science. And after what now amounts to a more than 50-year career as a science writer, I have never been attacked or belittled or discriminated against by virtue of being a woman. So I was in a bubble, just a lucky bubble, and not realizing the issue of women in science until I began work on my previous book, The Glass Universe, which is about a group of women astronomers at Harvard. And it's a great story of scientific discovery. But the thing that happened was that I discovered something about myself. Over and over, in writing about them, I was surprised by what they had done. And I had to admit that I had come to them with embarrassingly low expectations. That in spite of all the open-mindedness around me, all the advantages I had not escaped the negative attitudes about women that were just in the air when I was growing up in the 1950s. And that really gave me pause. And I would say I've got the religion now. And I am really keen on stories about women in science. And someone suggested that I should write about Madame Curie. And I thought, no, I don't want to do that, because I've already read a biography of her. I don't really have anything new to say. I wouldn't want to just regurgitate her life story. But right around that same time, I was asked to review a book called Women in Their Element, which was a collection of about 35 essays about women chemists. And I recognized maybe 3 of the names in the table of contents, 2 of which were Madame Curie and her daughter Irene. But as I read, I was surprised to see how many times Madame Curie's name popped up in the other profiles. This one had been her student. That one had traveled from Norway to work with her. And by about the 5th or 6th instance, it really started to look like a network. So I did a little research through the Curie Museum in Paris, and it turned out that there were about 45 women who passed through Madame Curie's laboratory. And it was her laboratory, because although she started out working with her husband, he was killed early in their lifetime. She was only 38 when he was struck down in a street accident. leaving her a widow with 2 young children. And against all odds and every tradition, she was invited to take over his laboratory because she was the only person qualified to do that. And she also stepped into his teaching position at the Sorbonne, making her the first woman ever to lecture there in a few hundred years of that institution's existence. So she was world famous, and she had shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with her husband. So women all over the world saw her as a beacon, and those who were interested in science, who wanted to follow her into this new field, which she named radioactivity, traveled to Paris and took their places with her, and then later went home to become, in several instances, the first female professors in their countries. And I thought, my goodness, I do have something new to say about Madame Curie, because this was really not known. And of course, I planned to go to Paris, work at the Curie Museum, work at the National Library, and then there was a pandemic. But because Madame Curie is Madame Curie, virtually everything about her has been digitized, including her lab notebooks, letters to her, from her, the grief journal that she kept for the year following her husband's death, and the notebooks where she recorded the milestones of her children. And so there was ample material, and of course all her scientific papers. And I looked back on my high school career, because all the time I'd spent writing about astronomy was not really good preparation for taking on a story about physics and chemistry. But I had wonderful chemistry in my past, and pretty good French too. And because I can read Italian and the grammar is the same, I was fine. And I didn't have to talk to anybody. I just had to read all these documents, so it didn't matter how long it took me. And I was highly motivated. And I think the hardest part of all was understanding the science as it was understood at the time, because this was a moment in both physics and chemistry when everything was about to change. And the periodic table that we see everywhere now was still a work in progress, which was why the Curies were able to discover 2 new elements. And you'd think they would have realized right away how dangerous the stuff was, because it burned their fingers. And the medical establishment immediately jumped to the idea of burning unwanted tissue. And for about 2 decades, radium was the cure for cancer, which only increased her fame. And in 1911, she won a 2nd Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. And she remains the only person ever to have won in both fields of science. And she was, through those decades, often the only woman in the room. She attended a series of elite physics meetings that were invitation only, where she conferred with the likes of Albert Einstein and Max Planck and Ernest Rutherford. And slowly it became clear how noxious the material was. She also suffered tremendous exposure to X-rays. During the First World War, because she was knowledgeable about X-rays, she outfitted a van and drove to the front lines to X-ray wounded soldiers. And she trained 150 French women to do that same vital work. And although she's been dead 90 years, she still serves as an inspirational figure. I was astounded throughout my writing of this book how many people would say to me, "Oh, she's my hero." And young people still consider her an inspirational figure, which we certainly need in these dark times. I'm going home in a few days to vote in the most contentious election of my lifetime. And I'm thinking a lot about misogyny and wondering if the people in my country are capable of electing a woman president. We'll find out. She was certainly no stranger to political strife, to war, to personal loss, but she had a sense of duty, of rising to any occasion with an attitude of, what can I do? And that feeling also contributes to her inspirational quality. There are some people who feel she's really like a zombie. You know, after 90 years, she should go away, because if she weren't there and making such a phenomenal figure, then maybe more women scientists would be known. But that's what I hope to communicate with this book, that she was never the only one. She didn't want that distinction in her lifetime, and she did everything she could to spread the work around. And how gratifying to her that her own daughter followed her into the laboratory, also married her lab partner, and also won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. What better outcome could she have hoped for? And her younger daughter, who was musically talented and did not ever want a career in science, but paid tribute to her mother throughout life in the letters they exchanged. The letters that the three of them shared and all kept have been published, and it was wonderful to be able to rely on that resource too. It's a book about science, but it's also a story about a working mother who had a great network of support so that she could continue doing her science and raising her family. So when the younger daughter wrote her mother's biography, thinking about her life, her great spirit, she said she was tempted to tell her mother's story as a legend. And that's certainly understandable. I was tempted to, but I liked her better as a mentor. And I just recently met a young woman who told me when she was 5 years old, she read something about Marie Curie, and she decided then and there that she wanted to be a chemist. And now she's 18, she's just enrolled in university, and she's a chemistry major, and she's going to make it. And so, like it or not, Marie Curie is still a lodestar for children, for adults. They don't have to be scientists. I've met actors, librarians, art historians. She appeals to everyone. And I was very grateful to have spent the pandemic in her company. And I miss her a lot. But it's been great to be able to share this much of her with you tonight. Thank you.